The firefight had been brief and terrifyingly one-sided. The Americans had not stumbled into an ambush. They had descended upon the encampment with surgical precision. The noise of their M16 rifles was a continuous, high-pitched rip, a sound that shredded the jungle's familiar symphony of insects and birds. Lai clutched her empty Type 56 rifle, its wooden stock slick with mud and sweat. She had fired her entire magazine at fleeting green shapes, a futile gesture against an overwhelming force. On the day she was captured, the most powerful weapon used against Lai, a hardened Viet Cong soldier, wasn't a gun or a bayonet. It was the smell of frying bacon. To understand why a simple breakfast could shatter an ideology, we have to go back to the world she came from, a world that had shrunk to the smell of cordite and damp earth, a universe of terror packed into the final moments before the American shouting began. It was a language she knew only from the snarling caricatures on propaganda posters, a series of harsh, barking sounds that promised a brutal end. For Lai, a soldier of the National Liberation Front since she was 16, the jungle had been everything: her sanctuary, her provider, her hiding place. For 3 years, her reality had been the close, humid darkness of the Cu Chi tunnels, a subterranean world where the sun was a distant memory, and the air tasted of clay and stale sweat. Life was a meticulous routine of scarcity. A cup of rice soup, thin and watery, was a morning meal. A shared cigarette, passed between 5 soldiers until it burned their fingertips, was a luxury. Their Bible was the collected writings of Ho Chi Minh, their psalms, the political indoctrination sessions led by the company cadre, a man whose eyes held the unwavering fire of absolute conviction. He taught them that their sacrifice was the fuel of the revolution, that their deprivation was a moral strength. The Americans, he preached, were the opposite, a hollow people, soft and decadent, their power derived from machines, not spirit. They were gluttons and imperialists, whose will to fight would crumble against the purity of the Vietnamese soul. Lai believed him. Every empty stomach, every night spent shivering with malaria, every fallen comrade reinforced this belief. Their suffering was a testament to their righteousness. Now her comrades, girls she had shared meager rations with, were being rounded up, their small, wiry frames swallowed by the sheer size of their captors. These were not the pot-bellied, cigar-chomping capitalists from the posters. They were young men, giants of muscle and gear, their faces grim and smeared with camouflage paint. Their equipment dripped with a casual sort of menace: ammunition belts, canteens, grenades, and radios that crackled with the alien language of command. As rough hands bound her wrists with a plastic tie, a searing pain shot up her leg from the shrapnel wound she'd been hiding for 2 days. In the jungle, an infection like this was a slow, agonizing death sentence. She had no idea that this very wound, a mark of her fight against the enemy, would soon become their most effective tool for dismantling her soul. Her mind retreated to the lessons, the oaths, the face of her section leader. She would not talk. She would not cry out. She would show them the strength of a Vietnamese patriot. She braced for the torture the party had promised. But what was waiting for her at the American base was not the agony she expected, but something far more psychologically disorienting. The journey was a blur of violent motion and noise. She was thrown into the back of a large olive-drab truck, its engine roaring with a power that seemed to shake the very air. The vehicle carved a path through the jungle with arrogant ease, crushing vegetation that she and her comrades had spent years learning to navigate with reverent stealth. Through the slats, she saw the scale of the American presence for the first time. Not as a fleeting shadow or the distant threat of a helicopter, but as an occupying reality. An endless convoy of identical trucks snaked along a road of packed red earth, a road that had appeared where a simple trail had been only months before, built by machines that could clear a kilometer of jungle in a single day. Helicopters, like monstrous dragonflies, crisscrossed the sky, their thumping blades a constant, oppressive heartbeat. This was not a small expeditionary force to be harassed and bled dry. This was a machine, vast and impossibly well supplied, and its sheer weight was crushing the world she knew. The cadre had told them that the Americans were bleeding, that their supply lines were weak. But what she saw was not an army bleeding, it was an army breathing, its mechanical lungs inhaling and exhaling a tidal wave of material. After hours of travel, the truck slowed, passing through a gate of concertina wire and sandbags. The destination was a sprawling complex of wooden buildings and tents, organized in unnervingly perfect lines under the harsh Sunday. This was Long Bin Post, a name whispered with fear in the tunnels, the administrative and logistical heart of the American presence in her country. It was here the Americans processed those they captured, the place where the party's warnings would become reality. As she was pulled from the truck, her bare feet hitting the hot, dusty ground, her senses were already on high alert, preparing for the smell of death, of disinfectant and fear. But the first thing that struck her was a scent so utterly alien it momentarily erased all thought. It was a thick, greasy, and powerful smell of sizzling animal fat, heavy with salt and smoke. It billowed from a long, low building with screened windows, a smell that clung to the air, rich and overwhelming. It was not the familiar, comforting aroma of pork roasted with fish sauce and lemongrass. It was something else, something foreign and decadent, a smell of pure, unadulterated animal protein being cooked in vast quantities. She saw an American guard walking by, a young man with a freckled face, eating strips of the dark, crispy meat from a metal tray. This was their food, their normal food. At the gates of her predicted hell, the first assault on her senses was not terror, but the incomprehensible, nauseating smell of frying bacon. The scent was a declaration of a different reality, a world of such casual abundance that this much fat and meat could be cooked in the open air. Her stomach, accustomed to little more than rice and boiled roots, clenched in confusion and disgust. This single smell was a more powerful piece of propaganda than any leaflet. It was an argument against everything she had been taught, delivered not in words, but in particles of fat hanging in the humid air. The expected brutality never came. Instead, they were herded into a processing building and subjected to something far more disorienting, a cold, systematic, and impersonal efficiency. They were stripped not of their dignity that she would fight for, but of the grime that had become their second skin, their armor against the jungle that had protected them for years. The black pajamas, patched and repatched until they were more thread than cloth, were taken and tossed into a pile to be burned. In their place, they were handed shapeless green shifts, rough but clean, and a set of undergarments that caused a ripple of confusion among the women. Lai stared at the brassiere in her hand, a contraption of straps and cups she had only seen in captured French magazines, a symbol of the Western vanity the cadres had railed against. It was an object so divorced from her reality of survival that it felt like an artifact from another planet. To wear it felt like a small, intimate betrayal of the Spartan ideals she had embodied. Next came the delousing. They were pushed into a concrete room and showered with a fine, chemical-smelling powder that made their skin tingle. It was humiliating, but it was a detached, almost medical form of humiliation. The American women who supervised the process were stern-faced and wore rubber gloves, their expressions betraying not cruelty, but a weary boredom, as if they were merely processing objects on an assembly line. This sterile indifference was more unnerving than the outright hatred she had prepared for, which at least would have been a recognizable emotion. But this was nothing compared to the true shock that waited behind the next concrete door. It was after the delousing that the true shock came, a moment that would forever divide her life into a before and an after. They were led into another concrete room, this one lined with rows of pipes and nozzles. A female guard, seeing their hesitation, mimed the act of washing, then turned a knob. With a hiss, hot water erupted from the shower heads. Not the cold, collected rainwater of the jungle, nor the lukewarm water of a stream, but a steady, steaming torrent of clean, hot water. The women gasped. Some flinched away, as if from a weapon. Lai stood frozen as the steam billowed around her, the sensation of such warmth on her skin, a feeling she had almost forgotten. In the tunnels, bathing was a quick wipe-down, with a damp rag in the cold, dark air. Hesitantly, she stepped under the spray. The water washed away the white powder, the mud, the sweat, the blood. It was a deluge of impossible luxury, a river of warmth that seemed to have no end. She could stand there for minutes, for an hour, and it would not stop. The sheer wastefulness of it was as shocking as the pleasure. Then came the soap. Each woman was handed a small rectangular bar. It was perfectly formed, pale green, and smelled of strange synthetic flowers. When Lai rubbed it between her hands, it exploded into a thick, creamy lather, more suds than she had ever seen. She washed her hair, her body, watching the dirt of the revolution spiral down the drain at her feet. In the jungle, a sliver of harsh lye soap was shared among a dozen soldiers, a treasure to be used sparingly. Here, an entire bar was hers alone. She could use it all, and it would likely be replaced. The thought was so staggering it felt like a form of madness. This was a level of casual, industrial production applied to the most personal of acts. But the final, most profound blow to her understanding of the enemy came in a small, discreet package. As they were drying themselves with coarse but clean towels, an American army nurse, a woman with tired eyes and blonde hair pinned neatly under her cap, moved down the line. She handed each of them a small stack of sanitary napkins. Thick, cotton pads wrapped in paper. The women stared at the objects in their hands, then at each other. In the jungle, they made do with rags, washed when they could, hidden away in shame. It was a private, monthly misery, a weakness to be endured in silence. The party taught that personal needs were secondary to the needs of the struggle. Yet here, the enemy, their captors, had anticipated this most intimate of needs and provided for it. They had created a system, a line item in a budget somewhere, for the menstrual cycles of their female prisoners. It was an act of methodical, logistical care that was so completely at odds with the image of the monstrous imperialist that Lai's mind could not process it. This was not propaganda. This was not a trick designed to impress them. This was a quiet, bureaucratic acknowledgement of their biology. It was an act more disarming than any weapon, a quiet demonstration of a system so rich and so organized that it could afford to care for the bodies of its enemies. She stood there, dripping, holding a bar of soap in one hand and a stack of sanitary napkins in the other, and felt the diamond-hard certainty of her world begin to crack. To understand just how far that crack would splinter, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the conclusion to this psychological war. The daily routine of the camp solidified this new, confusing reality. 3 times a day, they were fed from a central mess hall. The morning meal was always accompanied by the smell of bacon, but now also included scrambled eggs, made from a yellow powder, and slices of soft white bread with pats of butter and small tubs of jam. The sheer caloric density was staggering. In her unit, a captured tin of American condensed milk was a feast to be shared among 20 people over several days. Here, milk was a beverage, served cold in a cup, and there was always more. Lai watched American guards throw away half-eaten pieces of bread, an act of waste so profound it felt like a physical blow. The food was bland to her palate, lacking the pungent fire of chili and fish sauce, but it was undeniably abundant. She and her comrades, gaunt and malnourished from years of war, began to gain weight. Their skin cleared, their hair regained its luster. Their bodies were betraying them, healing and growing stronger on the enemy's rations, silently accepting a truce their minds still refused to consider. The pain from the shrapnel in her leg was a familiar fire, a reminder of her sacrifice during the last firefight. In the jungle, the medic, a boy no older than herself, had simply poured rice liquor on the wound and wrapped it in a dirty strip of cloth. It was now hot and swollen, the angry red streaks of infection creeping up her calf. She had hidden the injury, walking with a subtle limp, expecting that any sign of weakness would lead to her being culled from the group, another casualty of war. In her world, the weak were a liability the revolution could not afford. But during a morning inspection, a watchful American nurse noticed her limp. Before Lai could protest, she was being half-carried, half-dragged towards a long wooden building with a red cross painted on its roof. This, she thought, is where it finally happens. This is the torture room, disguised as a place of healing. Interrogation would begin under the guise of medical treatment. The infirmary was a world of impossible cleanliness. The air smelled sharp and sterile, a scent of alcohol and antiseptic that was the opposite of the jungle's rot and decay. The floors were scrubbed, the beds were made with crisp white sheets, and medical instruments gleamed from stainless steel trays. It was a quiet, orderly place that seemed completely detached from the war raging just beyond the wire. She was placed on an examination table, the cool surface a shock against her feverish skin. An American doctor, a man with graying hair and glasses, examined her leg with a detached professionalism. He spoke in quiet, clipped English to the nurse, who then turned to a South Vietnamese translator. "The doctor says the wound is badly infected," the translator said, his voice flat. "He needs to clean it and give you medicine, or you could lose the leg. Or your life." Lai braced herself, expecting a rough, painful procedure designed to make her scream. Instead, the doctor was surprisingly gentle. He administered a local anesthetic, a needle prick that soon rendered her lower leg numb, a strange and unsettling sensation of being disconnected from her own pain. He then went to work, cleaning the wound with meticulous care, removing the deeply embedded metal fragment with a pair of forceps. He held it up for her to see, a twisted piece of American steel. "From a grenade," the translator explained. The irony was not lost on her. The same force that had wounded her was now working to heal her. While the doctor worked, the female nurse from the processing center prepped a syringe. Lai watched, her heart pounding, as she injected the contents into her hip. "Penicillin," the translator said, "a very strong antibiotic. To fight the infection." Penicillin was a mythical substance, a miracle drug they had only heard about in whispers, a medicine that could save soldiers from almost certain death by gangrene. The French had it, the Americans had it, but for the Viet Cong, it was rarer than gold. And here it was being given to her, an enemy combatant, with the same casual efficiency as a meal. Over the next week, she was kept in the infirmary. Every day the nurse would change her dressing, her touch gentle but firm. She would check Lai's temperature, offer her a glass of clean water, and make notes on a clipboard at the foot of the bed. The nurse rarely smiled, but her actions spoke a language Lai was beginning to understand. It was the language of duty, of care. One afternoon, while changing the bandage, the nurse noticed Lai shivering despite the heat. Without a word, she left and returned with another blanket, tucking it carefully around her. It was a small, simple act of human kindness, devoid of any political meaning. And it was this act, more than the powerful medicine or the clean sheets, that constituted the true heresy. It was a violation of the fundamental law of war as she understood it. The enemy was the enemy. They were not supposed to be kind. They were not supposed to offer comfort. They were supposed to hate her as she was supposed to hate them. She lay in that impossibly clean bed, her leg healing, her fever receding, and wrestled with a profound cognitive dissonance. The party had taught her that the Americans were devils, but the devil would not bring you a second blanket. The devil would not waste his magic medicine on you. This enemy was something more complicated, something more dangerous than a simple monster. This enemy was human, and their humanity was a more potent psychological weapon than any bomb or bullet. Beyond the daily routine of meals and muster, a new war was being waged, one of pictures, sounds, and questions that arrived on the wind and in the hands of the guards. Lai, now recovered and back in the general population, became a keen observer of the camp's machinery. She began to understand that what she had first perceived as luxury was, in fact, logistics. The camp was not an anomaly. It was a microcosm of the entire American war effort. Every morning, she watched convoys of massive 6x6 trucks rumble past the perimeter fence, kicking up clouds of red dust. They were loaded with crates, sacks, fuel drums, and an endless variety of supplies. One truck might carry enough rice to feed her entire jungle battalion for a month. Another would be filled with nothing but cans of Coca-Cola, a frivolous luxury that spoke of a supply chain so vast and efficient it could afford to transport sugary water thousands of miles into a war zone. Helicopters landed in a constant rotation, delivering mail, fresh vegetables, and even ice cream for the American personnel. It was a spectacle of such overwhelming material superiority that it made the Viet Cong's own heroic efforts at supply porters, carrying sacks of rice for hundreds of miles along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, seem like a child's game. The cadre had called it a triumph of the human spirit over the machine. But from here, it looked like a triumph of flesh and bone against an avalanche of steel. The psychological assault was not limited to observations of hardware. One day, a young guard, barely older than Lai herself, was reading a magazine while on duty. When he finished, he tossed it into a waste bin. That night, one of the prisoners furtively retrieved it. Under the dim light of a single bare bulb in their barracks, the women huddled together, turning the glossy pages of a copy of Life magazine. The images inside were from another universe. There were advertisements for gleaming automobiles the size of small boats, for refrigerators packed with food, for smiling families standing in front of tidy houses with green lawns. The concept of a private home, a personal vehicle, a machine that kept your food cold, these were abstractions as fantastical as any myth. There were photographs of American cities with towering buildings and highways clogged with traffic. Even the articles that depicted problems, civil rights, protests, political debates, were bewildering. They showed a country that was not only strong enough to fight a war on the other side of the world, but confident enough to openly display its own internal conflicts. In a society where the party controlled all information, where dissent was treason, this public self-criticism was unthinkable. It suggested a different kind of strength, one that did not rely on absolute, enforced unity. Here, Lai's ideology was being attacked on two fronts: the overwhelming abundance of American industry and the shocking humanity of a simple nurse. Both were devastating weapons. But which one do you think was more effective at breaking a soldier's will? Pause the video and comment abundance or humanity below. I want to see what you think. Then came the loudspeakers. Every afternoon, a calm male voice would begin speaking from speakers mounted on poles around the camp. He spoke perfect, northern accented Vietnamese. He was not shouting propaganda, he was explaining the Chua Hoi, or Open Arms, program. He spoke of the government of South Vietnam's desire for reconciliation. He promised that any Viet Cong who laid down their arms would be welcome back, given medical treatment, job training, and a new life. At first, the women would chant patriotic slogans to drown out the voice, repeating the party line that the program was a trick, a lie to lure them to their deaths. Lai chanted along with them, her voice full of practiced defiance. But the words from the speaker were being reinforced by the reality around her. The program promised good medical treatment. She had received it. It promised adequate food and shelter. She had that too. The voice on the loudspeaker described a path to a life of peace and security, while the pages of the magazine in her hand showed a world of incredible comfort. The gap between what the party had told her about the enemy and what she was experiencing herself was becoming an impossible chasm. The hardliners in the barracks would whisper at night, reminding everyone of their oaths, speaking of American treachery. But their words, once a source of strength, now seemed brittle. They were arguing against a reality that the prisoners could see, taste, and feel every single day. The seeds of doubt, planted by the smell of bacon and watered by the endless flow of hot water, were beginning to sprout in the fertile ground of overwhelming, undeniable evidence. The choice was no longer as simple as surrender or resistance. It was about which reality was true, the one she had been taught to die for, or the one she was now forced to live in. The breaking point did not come with a bang, but with a quiet, human unraveling. It happened to a girl named Mai, who was only 15 and had been conscripted as a battlefield messenger. She was not a hardened ideologue like Lai. She was a child from a small village, and her revolutionary zeal was a thin veneer over a core of profound fear. For weeks, she had grown quieter, her eyes wide with a confusion that was slowly eclipsing her patriotism. She would eat the American food with a quiet hunger, not the defiant necessity of the others. She spent long periods of time watching the guards, their casual interactions, their laughter. One evening, during the nightly political discussion led by the senior woman in the barracks, a fierce, unwavering cadre named Mai began to weep. It was a silent, shoulder-shaking cry that she tried to stifle in her blanket. Ba, noticing the movement, stopped her lecture. "What is this, little sister? Tears are a bourgeois weakness." Mai could not stop. "They gave me medicine for my fever," she whispered, her voice choked. "The nurse," she smiled at me. She smiled. Ba's face hardened. "It is a trick. The snake smiles before it bites." But Mai shook her head, tears streaming down her face. It was a real smile. The cadre slapped her, a sharp, cracking sound in the quiet room. "Fool, you dishonor your comrades. You dishonor the sacrifice of your family." But the spell was broken. Mai's simple, honest confession had given voice to the secret doubt that had been festering in all of them. The slap was an act of desperation, an attempt to enforce an ideology that was dissolving like salt in water. A few days later, Lai watched as Mai walked, head held high, to the camp commander's office, a Churhoi leaflet clutched in her hand. She had defected. She had chosen the reality of the warm blanket and the nurse's smile over the remembered hardship of the tunnels and the cadre's slap. For Lai, this was the final, quiet collapse of her world. Mai's defection was not a betrayal of the cause. It was a surrender to the evidence. Lai's own revolutionary fervor, once a blazing fire, had been reduced to cold embers. She had not come to admire the Americans, but she could no longer blindly hate them. She understood that their power came not just from their bombs and rifles, but from their refrigerators, their magazines, their penicillin, and their perplexing, inconsistent humanity. They were a force of nature, too vast to be understood, too powerful to be fought, and too complicated to be simply labeled evil. Her black and white world was gone, shattered into a million shades of gray. Her final months in the camp passed in a detached haze. She went through the motions, but the fire was gone. She no longer engaged in the political debates in the barracks, listening instead with a distant sort of pity for the hardliners whose faith remained so absolute in the face of so much contradictory evidence. Months later, her name was called. She was part of a prisoner exchange. As she was led through the camp for the last time, the entire journey replayed in her mind. The chaotic capture, the disorienting processing, the shocking abundance, the heretical kindness. At the gate, she was given back a set of clean black pajamas. They felt like a costume from a life she no longer lived. She stepped outside the wire, back into the familiar, humid air of her homeland. The trees, the red earth, the sounds of Vietnam, it was all the same, but she was irrevocably different. As she stood waiting for the North Vietnamese truck that would take her away, a breeze drifted from the camp behind her. On it, faint but unmistakable, was the greasy, smoky smell of bacon frying for the guards' next meal. The scent was no longer just nauseating or strange. It was now a permanent part of her memory, the scent of a different world, a world that had broken not her body, but the absolute certainty of her beliefs. She was free, but she would carry the scent of her enemy's impossible abundance with her forever. Lai's story is one of thousands that highlight a different side of the Vietnam War, and it's a prime example of the Chu Hoi, or Open Arms program, which convinced over 100,000 Viet Cong to defect. If you believe this perspective is a crucial part of understanding the complexities of war, share this documentary with someone who needs to see it. We are doing a full deep dive on how that entire psychological program worked in our next video. To make sure you don't miss that investigation, and to continue exploring the hidden corners of history with us, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support allows us to keep telling these important stories.